Have you ever truly been alone in the woods? I don't mean the kind of alone where you can still hear cars on a distant road or see another campsite through the trees. I mean the kind where you can stand in the middle of a forest and realize that, for miles in every direction, there might not be another person around. That's what I wanted. Instead, I found out someone had been watching me. The first photograph was taken before I even knew I was being watched. The second showed me setting up my tent. The third showed me sitting beside my campfire. And the fourth had been taken while I was asleep. I didn't discover those photographs until the following night, after I had already tried to leave and found a tree blocking the only road out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 hours earlier, everything had felt completely normal. I'd driven almost 4 hours to reach a remote section of national forest because I wanted a campsite where I wouldn't have to deal with anyone. The campground was technically still open, although most of the sites had been closed after a storm damaged the access road. Only 3 sites were being maintained. I chose the last one. It sat at the end of a narrow loop, surrounded by tall trees. There was a picnic table, a fire ring, and enough flat ground for my tent. Behind the campsite was a wall of forest. No cabins, no nearby houses, no other campers. Exactly what I wanted. I had just finished putting up my tent when a ranger's truck rolled slowly into the campground. An older man stepped out wearing a faded green jacket. He looked at my car, then my tent, then the forest behind me. "You staying tonight?" "Yeah." He nodded. "Road closes at 8. I'll be gone tomorrow." He started walking away, then stopped. There used to be a service road behind this campground. I looked toward the trees. I saw a trail back there. "That's it." "Still open?" "No." His answer came too quickly. "Storm damaged it." He looked past me again. "Don't use it." "Wasn't planning to." He nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he stared toward the trees for several seconds. Then he said something that sounded strange enough that I remember every word. "If you hear somebody whistling after dark, don't answer." I smiled. "Why?" He looked at me. "Because nobody should be back there." Then he got into his truck and left. At the time, I thought he'd been trying to make sure I took the warning seriously. I didn't realize he'd been warning me about something much more specific. After sunset, I made dinner and sat beside the fire. The forest became completely dark beyond the small circle of light. Around 9:30, I heard a branch snap. I looked up. Nothing. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. Soft, slow, somewhere behind the trees. I stood and aimed my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught trunks, leaves, and empty darkness. Nothing else. I waited. Then I heard 3 short whistles. I remembered the ranger. I didn't answer. The sound came again. 3 notes. This time farther away. I stayed outside for another minute before going into my tent. I told myself it had probably been a bird. At 11:40, something touched the side of my tent. The fabric pressed inward beside my shoulder. I froze. The pressure moved slowly across the tent wall, then disappeared. I switched on my flashlight. Nothing. I listened. No footsteps. No voice. No wind. I checked my phone. 11:43. Then came the whistle. 3 notes. Right outside. I didn't move. A few seconds later, the whistle came again, but now it sounded farther away. I stayed awake until almost sunrise. When I finally unzipped the tent, I saw a boot print in the damp ground about 10 feet away. It was deep enough to show the tread, but there was only one. No second print. No trail. Just one footprint. I crouched beside it and took a picture. Then I noticed something else. A black backpack was leaning against a tree on the edge of my campsite. I was certain it hadn't been there the night before. I checked my own gear. Nothing missing. Nothing obviously disturbed. But I didn't like it, so I decided to leave. I packed my tent and most of my equipment and carried everything to my car. That's when I noticed the passenger door. It was open. I always lock my car. I checked inside. Nothing looked stolen. Then I saw the glove compartment. It was open. Inside was the paper map I'd brought. Someone had unfolded it. I picked it up. There were 2 circles drawn in black ink, one around my campsite, the other around the old service road. I stared at them. Then I saw 3 words written beside the second circle. You are here. I looked toward the forest. For the first time, I didn't wonder whether someone had been near my campsite. I knew. I got into my car and locked the doors. The engine started normally. I drove toward the campground entrance. 5 minutes later, I stopped. A tree was lying across the road. It was too large to drive around. I got out and looked at the broken trunk. The wood was fresh. Leaves were still green. There hadn't been a storm, and the tree hadn't been there when I drove in. I looked at the ground. There were tire marks on the dirt beside the road. Fresh ones. They disappeared behind the fallen tree. I walked closer. Then I saw an orange strip of fabric tied around a branch, the same color as a marker I'd noticed near my campsite the day before. I stepped backward. Someone hadn't simply left a tree in the road. Someone might have wanted the road blocked. I got back into my car. There was no signal. I could have tried moving the tree, but even if I managed it, I didn't know what I'd find farther down the road. So I turned around. As I drove back toward my campsite, I noticed another orange marker, then another. They were spaced evenly, like trail markers, except there was no official trail. I reached my campsite just before sunset. My tent was still standing. My fire was cold, and my backpack was sitting on the picnic table. I stopped the car. I had left that backpack inside the vehicle. I didn't go near it immediately. I watched it through the windshield. The zipper was open. Eventually, I stepped out. Inside were my flashlight, water bottle, and spare clothes. Then I noticed my car keys. My main set of keys was sitting inside the backpack. I checked my pocket. My spare set was still there. Someone had entered my car, taken my keys, moved the backpack, then returned the keys. They hadn't stolen anything. They had simply wanted me to know they could get inside. I backed away from a table. A twig snapped behind me. I turned. Nothing. Then I saw a second boot print beside the first one. Fresh. I got into the car and locked the doors. I wasn't leaving the vehicle again. At around 10:20 that night, headlights appeared between the trees. A pickup truck slowly approached the campsite. It stopped about 50 yards away. A man stepped out. Dark jacket. Baseball cap. He didn't call out. He just stood beside the truck looking at my car. Then he walked toward me. I lowered the window only an inch. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I'm fine. You shouldn't be here." The ranger told me that. His expression changed. "You talked to him?" "Yesterday." He looked toward the forest, then back at me. "Did you find a backpack?" I said nothing. He nodded slowly. "You should leave before dark." I tried. "I know." That was the sentence that changed everything. "I know." Not "I saw you." Not "I heard about it." "I know." I locked the doors again. He noticed. "Relax." I didn't answer. He pointed toward the forest. "People use that old road." "For what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned around. Before getting back into his truck, he said, "If you hear 3 whistles tonight, stay inside." Then he drove away. I watched his taillights disappear. I couldn't decide whether he'd been threatening me or warning me. Either way, I knew I wasn't staying in that car until morning. I packed only what I could carry: water, phone, flashlight, map, first aid kit, keys. Then I noticed the orange markers. They started near my campsite and continued into the woods. I followed them, not because I trusted them, because whoever had placed them had created a path. And if the main road had been deliberately blocked, I needed another way out. The trail climbed gently through the trees. After about 15 minutes, I reached a clearing below a slope. There was an old campsite hidden there. A collapsed tent, rusting cooking equipment, empty water containers, and a folding chair. The chair was facing the trail. It wasn't covered in dirt. Someone had been sitting there recently. I looked beneath it. There was a plastic storage box. Inside were photographs. I picked up the first one. It showed my campsite, taken from the trees. I turned it over. Yesterday's date. The next photograph showed my car arriving. Another showed me unloading equipment. Another showed me putting up my tent. Then one showed me sitting beside the fire. I kept going. The photographs weren't just of me. There were dozens of them. Different campers. Different years. The same forest. Some people were photographed arriving. Others were photographed sleeping. Some were photographed leaving. I found my own photographs at the front. The newest one showed me standing beside the boot print that morning. The photograph had been taken from somewhere behind me, close enough to see what I was looking at. My hand started shaking. I put the photograph down. Then I heard a whistle. 3 notes. I looked up. Nothing. A voice came from behind the trees. You weren't supposed to find that. I turned. The man from the pickup stood about 30 feet away. I took a step backward. Who are you? He didn't answer. Why are you photographing people? He glanced toward the storage box. You need to leave. I've been trying. He took another step. I stepped back. Then I heard a second voice. Don't go toward him. It came from somewhere to my left. The man stopped. I looked at him. He looked toward the trees. For the first time, he looked frightened. That was when I realized something. He hadn't expected anyone else to be there. I ran. I went downhill through the trees. Branches caught my jacket. Leaves slid beneath my boots. Behind me, I heard the man shout, "Stop!" I kept running. Then the second voice called again. Keep going. I didn't know who was speaking. I didn't know whether they were helping me. But the man behind me was the one I'd already seen watching my campsite. So I kept running. The orange markers continued downhill. I followed them until the trees opened onto an old maintenance road. An abandoned white utility truck was parked there. The driver's door was open. Inside was a radio. I picked it up. Static filled the speaker. Then a voice came through. Do not go back to the campsite. I froze. Who is this? Static. Then, follow the orange markers. I looked behind me. Nothing. I started walking. The markers led uphill toward another road. Then I saw the ranger's truck. He was standing beside it. He looked at me, then immediately looked past me into the forest. Get in. I climbed into the passenger seat. He drove. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, who were those men? He kept his eyes on the road. People who've been using those woods for a long time. For what? He didn't answer. Why were they photographing campers? He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Some people like knowing who comes into isolated places. That's not an answer. No. He looked at me. It's not. We drove another mile. Then he said, they don't want people finding the old road. Why? He was silent. What is back there? He finally answered. Nothing that should still be there. That was all he would say. We reached the main road shortly before sunset. The ranger stopped beside my car. Before I got out, he said, don't go back. I won't. And don't post those photographs. Why? Because someone will go looking for that place. I looked at him. You knew about the photographs. He didn't answer. You knew. He stared straight ahead. Then he said quietly, I knew people had been watching campers. That wasn't the same thing. I got out. I drove until I reached a town with cell service. I called the police. They eventually searched the area. The old campsite was difficult to locate. The men were gone. The utility truck was gone. The folding chair was gone. The storage box was gone. Even the orange markers had disappeared. But the photographs I'd taken were real. There were more than 50 of them. The investigators couldn't identify everyone, but they found enough evidence to believe the area had been used repeatedly. What they couldn't determine was why. There were no obvious valuables in the photographs. No stolen equipment. No clear pattern of theft. Just people, campers, being watched, being photographed. I thought that was the end. I stopped camping alone. I stopped talking about remote places. And for several months, I didn't think about that forest. Then, almost a year later, I found something in my car. It was underneath the passenger seat. A folded paper. My old map. I had given the original to the police. At least, I thought I had. I opened it. The 2 circles were still there. My campsite. The old service road. But there was a 3rd circle. It wasn't in the forest. It was around the town where I lived. Beside it were 3 words. You left too early. I reported it. The police couldn't tell me who had written it. There were no useful fingerprints. No obvious evidence that anyone had followed me home. But I stopped leaving my car unlocked. I stopped telling people where I was going. And I stopped believing that the forest itself had been the dangerous part. It wasn't. The trees hadn't chased me. The darkness hadn't trapped me. The whistles hadn't been supernatural. The frightening part was much simpler. Someone could stand 50 feet away from you in a forest and watch you for hours without you ever knowing. A year after that, I drove past the campground with a friend. I wasn't there to camp. We were just passing through. The campground had been permanently closed. A new sign stood beside the entrance. Area closed, no public access. We kept driving, but I looked toward the trees. About 50 yards inside the forest, I saw something. A black backpack, standing upright against a tree. Exactly like the one I'd seen that first morning. Then I noticed an orange marker tied to a branch above it, and beneath the marker was a small piece of white paper. I could barely see the writing from the road, but I recognized it immediately. 3 words. You are here. I told my friend to keep driving. He asked why. I didn't answer, because the thing that scared me wasn't the backpack. It wasn't the orange marker. It wasn't even the message. It was the fact that the paper looked new, and whoever had placed it had put it somewhere I would eventually see it. If you're enjoying these kinds of stories, subscribe to the Forgotten Campsite, because some places aren't forgotten because nobody remembers them. Sometimes they're forgotten because somebody wants them left alone. And after everything that happened, there's one question I still can't answer. If the men in those woods were the ones watching campers, who was the person on the radio telling me where to run?